Well, we definitely have some movement this time around. That's right, it's Sunday night once again, or I guess at least Monday by the time you're watching this, which means it's time once again for NHL Power Rankings, the top 10 teams in the NHL, 5 weeks into the season. And while it did take a while, largely the same 10 teams have been in these power rankings with kind of just one team moving in and out each week. Well, this time, the chaos of the NHL finally found its way to these power rankings with 3 new teams in this top 10 from last week. I mean, pretty much other than the top 5 teams that we have a pretty good idea of, as well as round about the bottom 5, we have a pretty good idea of who those are as well. The other 22 or so teams, yeah, it's pretty much an unpredictable, chaotic mess there any given night, which I suppose does make the games a little bit more interesting and certainly makes this power rankings a little bit more interesting when I have to come up with it here at the end of each week. And that definitely extends to the teams that I would normally have in this honorable mention section before getting in the top 10, the teams that are just outside the top 10 but not quite there. However, this week that's mostly teams that are, well, just having fallen out of the top 10, and I don't feel like honorable is necessarily the right way to describe them at this point in time, even though with a good week they could hop right back into the top 10. And then there's teams like the Penguins who had a bad enough start to their season that although they have had a pretty hot stretch here of late, are still a couple more good weeks away from getting into the honorable mention or certainly the top 10. But there is one team that I will give an honorable mention to before getting into the top 10, and that would be the Toronto Maple Leafs, who are trying to climb their way back in after falling out a couple weeks ago. Now, this is definitely a team that I just don't really know what to do with. They're a perfect embodiment of that chaos that is the large chunk of the middle of the league. They'll give up 6 to the Sabres, then score 6 against the Lightning, then give up 6 to the Senators, and then win 2 straight. But I'm putting them here because they are, well, still a team with a pretty decent record, and they have now won 2 straight, even if one was against the Flames. The most recent win was against a very good Vancouver team that is one of those 5 teams that is safely inside that top 5. And there's also the fact that they still do seem like a team that has the talent, or should have the talent, to easily be within the top 10 teams in the league if they can get things figured out. At the very least, the guys that should be scoring for them have been, so if they can find any way to get depth scoring and figure out any kind of defense, then they shouldn't have too much trouble jumping back into this top 10. But in that 10th spot, at least for now anyway, and I'm probably a crazy person for doing this, but I guess it's just an extra sign of how chaotic things have been here, and the fact that I really didn't feel like the Avs in particular deserve to be in the top 10 after the last couple weeks that they've had. But in the 10th spot, I currently have the Capitals. Now, I'm sure there's already people going into the comments to start typing and calling me completely out of my mind for having the Capitals anywhere near the top 10, because this is far from a perfect team still this season. I mean, they're scoring at the 2nd worst rate in the NHL to only, obviously, the Sharks. But even at that, they're still winning games somehow, some way. Largely because they're a top 10 team in preventing goals and have been getting at least average or above average goaltending from all 3 of their goaltenders, and actually very good goaltending from Charlie Lindgren in the 3 games that he's played. So even though they still do have that glaring wart of that terrible offensive start to the season, that would maybe be a little bit more concerning if it was Ovechkin doing all the scoring for them and they just weren't able to find any depth scoring whatsoever. But they still are now 7-4-2 somehow, with Ovechkin sitting on just 4 goals 13 games in. So I guess, at least to me anyway, it seems like with this team, they should eventually get the scoring going, at least with Ovechkin anyway, and if they can keep up this ability to keep the puck out of their own net, then they should be able to find some success this season. Now, there are a couple of pretty big ifs in there, so this is certainly far from a top 10 pick that I feel particularly great about sticking around for very long. But at least right now, they were, well, kind of the next best option to some teams that really didn't seem like they deserved to still be in the top 10 for now. The team that I have in the 9th spot, though, I do feel a little bit better about being here. At the very least, they've been in this top 10 list now every week that I've done it so far, in the Detroit Red Wings. Now, that being said, it was not a particularly impressive week for the Red Wings. In fact, it was a type of week that from 9th, they usually would have found their way off of this list if it wasn't for all the other movement that happened around them. So they stick in the same spot that they were last week, even with the loss to New York, which is forgivable. It's just a 2-goal, 5-3 loss to a team that we'll be seeing later on. Then they lose in overtime to Montreal, and while they're not the only team that lost in overtime to Montreal that we'll see on this list, it's still not the best loss ever. And while they did at least finish up the week with a win, it was still a 5-4 win against a Blue Jackets team that I think we could put in that bottom 5 type of category. At least for the Red Wings, though, even with their power play falling quickly back to earth from the incredible start to the season they had, they're still finding a way to score enough goals, 9 more goals in 3 games this week, which is enough, at least with the hot start they had to the season, to keep them in that top 5 in goals for per game. Goals against, they're still around the middle of the league, but with a league that doesn't really know what teams are good and what aren't, it's still a team that's going to be in this top 10 with the strong start that they had, as long as they can stay somewhere around 500 or a little bit better for a while here. In the 8th spot, though, we finally have a team that actually had a good week, and I feel good about being in this top 10, and is, well, starting to look like the team that we thought they were going to be at the start of the season, finally getting in the top 10 after being an honorable mention for, I think, each of the last 3 weeks. I've got the Carolina Hurricanes. Now, yes, the Hurricanes did start their week by having to go to overtime to beat the Sabres, who have had a shaky start to their season. I guess they're still 1 game away from 500, but with how good the East has been, that puts them, well, not in great standing in the current playoff picture. Either way, with the Hurricanes, a win is still a win. They didn't end up getting a win, though, when they went to play Florida, losing 5-2 there, but I'd say they made up for it when they went into Tampa Bay the next game and shut out the Lightning 4-0, which brings me to my next point, that this is a team that had that horrendous start to the season at keeping pucks out of their own net, giving up goals like they were candy on Halloween, but they've now managed to somehow, even with that terrible start, climb their way back up to around league average in goals for per game over the course of the whole season. In fact, when it comes to expected goals against at 5-on-5, they're one of the 2 best teams defensively at this point in the season. So it seems like they've finally figured out whatever was going on there early on, and are starting to get some goal scoring to match, which, if they can keep that going, this is a team that will find their way back up towards the upper end of this top 10 and staying in this top 10 for a while to come. And then in the 7th spot, the hottest team in the NHL, or at the very least, the team that has the longest winning streak on this list, and also the team that had the best week of any team on this list, is the Florida Panthers, the 3rd and final team jumping all the way into this top 10 that wasn't here before. And for the Panthers, they're doing it by scoring a whole heck of a lot of goals, scoring 18 goals in 4 games this week. So finally finding that goal scoring that wasn't necessarily there at the beginning of the season, which is a large part of why they've really rebounded after a shaky start to their season. And sure, the Panthers did win 3 of the 4 games they played this week by just 1 goal. Weirdly, the game that they won by 3 was against Carolina. Meanwhile, it took overtime to beat both Columbus and DC, and then they just won by a goal here on Sunday against Chicago. Still, 4 wins are 4 wins, and it's been enough, with some help of teams in front of them scuffling, to rocket them all the way to 2nd in their division, below only one of the 2 teams that have been glued to the top of this list. And obviously, Reinhart having 11 goals and 10 assists through 14 games is a big part of that. But we talked about how the Capitals have been able to win games even with Ovechkin not scoring. Well, the Panthers have been able to win games and score a lot, even with Tkachuk only sitting on 3 goals 14 games in, which you would have to think is going to change, because even if you have doubts about Ovechkin with his age, yeah, Matthew Tkachuk is definitely going to be scoring more than the pace that he's currently on. Up next in the 6th spot, I have the LA Kings, who, like the Red Wings, did not necessarily have the most impressive week. They too have a 1-1-1 record, so 2 losses and a win, but they get the extra point because of the overtime loser point in the NHL. But they stay just dropping 1 spot from 5 to 6 and not farther, because that 1 win that they had, unlike with the Red Wings, was a particularly impressive 4-1 win against the Vegas Golden Knights. Now, on the other hand, the 2 losses they have were an overtime loss to the Penguins, who all of a sudden that looks like a little bit better of a win than it would have at the start of the season. But then they also lose to a scuffling Flyers team that gave San Jose their first win. So I guess you take the good with the bad, but they do beat a division rival and beat them by 3 goals, a team that had only lost 1 other game in regulation to that point. So for the Kings, I don't think there's really anything to worry about. They still are riding, again, a pretty hot start, and at least managed to get 3 points in 3 games. And also, like Detroit, they did score 9 goals in those 3 games for another 3 goal per game, nice and clean, which drags their goals for per game all the way down to a 2nd best in the NHL, 4 goals per game. And even on top of that, this is one of the best teams at 5-on-5 when it comes to goals for expected as well as goals against expected. So yeah, 5-on-5, they're one of the best teams in the NHL by the analytics, and Talbot's been fantastic, plus they're scoring goals. I think they'll be perfectly fine. Which is unfortunate because, again, well, I wouldn't mind if they could slow down with a couple of other teams in the division. So then we get into the top 5, where I do think there's a little bit of a gap forming here between these top 5 teams and, well, the rest of the league, even the other 5 that I've already mentioned. And we'll start with the Dallas Stars, who had a pretty good week in their own right, so fifth place kind of shows where the other teams are at, as the Stars only lost this week in 4 games was a 3-2 loss at the hands of Boston, and even if it was in regulation, that is not a terrible loss as losses go, and certainly one that you can forgive them for, especially when they follow it up with a 5-2 handling of Columbus, then 3-2 over Winnipeg, and then absolutely destroying Minnesota on Sunday, 8-3. And for the Stars, with the one concern that we had early on in the season with this team being the slow start offensively for them, seemingly figured out. I mean, again, 8 goals against Minnesota and already scoring decently before then. Yeah, I think this team, especially with the defense still clearly there and Ottinger still one of the best goaltenders in the NHL early on, yeah, they are clearly one of the NHL's best teams. And again, one more time, especially with that goal scoring aspect of how they've been playing recently, they've been getting that contribution from, well, exactly the places you'd like to see it come from. Pavelski has 6, Robertson's gotten going with 5, Duchesne and Hintz both have 5, and Wyatt Johnston is leading the team with 7, as he seems to be at least having the best sophomore season of any of the guys that were in the running for that Calder last year. Even with all that being said, though, I still didn't feel like it was quite enough from the Stars to bump them above the team that I have in 4th in the Vancouver Canucks. Now, the Canucks did, unlike the Stars, have a pretty convincing loss 5-2 at the hands of Toronto. It was in Toronto, but still not a team as good as Boston is, and they didn't, keep it as close as LA was against Boston. But they also had 3 pretty convincing wins, 5-2 over each of Ottawa and Montreal, and 6-2 over the lowly Oilers. So even if that isn't the strongest schedule of 4 teams, they can only play the teams that they're given, and they handled the teams they're supposed to handle, which is more than I can say for the team that I cheer for. So clearly then everything is still sunshine and rainbows in Canuckland. Elias Pettersson is leading the NHL in points with 25. Quinn Hughes has a share of 3rd and leading all defensemen with 22. Meanwhile, Brock Besser has a share of 2nd when it comes to goals with 11. So yeah, it's safe to say things are going pretty well for Vancouver when it comes to the results. Now, with that all having been said about the Canucks, and it's true that the results are really all that matters, the underlying numbers do point to a potential regression to the mean coming for this team. And that's not just coming from a Kraken fan who would like to see them come back to earth a little bit, but this is a team who is well below both league averages in expected goals for at 5-on-5 and expected goals against at 5-on-5. Well, I guess to be fair, they're just under league average when it comes to goals against expected per game at 5-on-5, but either way, at 5-on-5, they are below league average in both of those categories, which is not something you would expect from a team that has one of the 4 best records in the NHL this far into the season. And it's still early on, but we're getting close to the quarter point. So then how are the Canucks getting the results they're getting? Well, for one, they're getting absolutely saved by Thatcher Demko, who again, I maintain is having a Vezina-type start to the season. In fact, his 12 goals saved above expected is almost 3 more than anybody else in the league at this point, according to Money Puck at the very least, and I don't think there's many other places that are going to disagree that Demko is at least one of the top 3 goaltenders in the NHL at this point. And they, on the offensive end, are getting helped out by having a more than 3% better shooting percentage than any other team in the league, sitting at 15.3, while the next highest is at 12. Both of which are things that, well, I suppose Demko could continue to be that good the rest of the season. That's what Vezina seasons are. We saw it in Boston last year. But that shooting percentage is not going to stay the same the rest of the season, and even their power play is probably overperforming where it will end up at the end of the year. Again, the results are all that matters, and the results are why I have Vancouver as high as they are, but there are at least tremors that a bigger earthquake could be on its way. It won't necessarily happen, but there are reasons to think it's possible. And to be fair, 2 of the teams above them are in a similar spot in at least one of the categories, and that includes the team just above them in the 3rd spot in the New York Rangers. Again, no change here for the Rangers, staying in 3rd. The Rangers are, when it comes to 5-on-5, massively outperforming what they should be scoring. Don't have the same shooting percentage of the Canucks, but they are scoring on more low danger chances than a lot of other teams are. But again, like with Vancouver, it doesn't really matter what the underlying stats say as long as you get the results. And for the Rangers, they keep getting the results with another 3 wins in 3 games this week, with a convincing 5-3 win over Detroit, then a 4-1 win over Minnesota, and maybe a little bit more concerning shootout win over Columbus here on Sunday. But again, a win's a win. It's 2 points in the standings either way. Now, I suppose with the advanced stats part of it, it is true that the Rangers are just below the Canucks with that second best shooting percentage in the league, but 12% is not that much more than the probably 11 or so that's going to lead the league come the end of the season. 12% is not out of the realm of possibility of where a team could end a season with a somewhat lucky year, you would say, but maybe creating some more dangerous opportunities would help out the Rangers. But again, in the same way, just like the Canucks, it doesn't really matter as long as you can keep the puck out of your own net if that offense starts to regress a little bit. And they, like the Canucks, have one of the best goaltending setups in the league with, I mean, if we were rating top goaltenders in the NHL, surprisingly, Jonathan Quick might be among them, and Shesterkin would be certainly right around that top 10 as well. And as far as that's concerned, I'd almost make the argument that that's a better situation for the Rangers to be in than where the Canucks are, because while obviously anybody would like to have a goaltender playing as well as Demko is right now, they don't necessarily have as good of an option to back him up if he were to get injured or just go through a cold streak and not really be usable for a little bit, which I wouldn't say is likely, but is always possible with how goaltenders can get hot and cold. With the Rangers, they're one of 3 teams in the league that have 2 viable top tier options, which obviously then gives them that extra layer of security from either an injury to one of them or a cold streak from one of those 2 guys. And it should probably not come as too much of a surprise that the other 2 teams that have incredible tandems where both goaltenders are among the best in the NHL to this point in the season are the 2 remaining teams here above the Rangers. And while it got close and I nearly flip-flopped them, they're staying right in the same spots. Again, we're splitting hairs between the 2, but in second, I have the Boston Bruins. Now, the Bruins would have taken first if it wasn't for the overtime loss to Montreal, and honestly, if that had been an overtime loss to say, well, if they'd lost in overtime to the Stars at the start of the week and then beaten Montreal the way they beat the Stars, Boston would probably be number 1 right now. But as it is, even with Vegas having the 1 loss to LA and that being a 3-goal loss, LA's a better team than Montreal, so I felt like it was enough to split that hair with Vegas having a slight lead coming into that week and give Vegas the slight edge right now. For Boston, though, they do have 2 wins on the week, while Vegas only played 2 games and won 1 of them. And it was a good win against Dallas, even if it was a close game. Dallas is obviously a good team, being one of these top 5. And then they go in and handle the Islanders 5-2 before having that overtime loss to Montreal. So for the Bruins, they just continue to roll on. Still just the 1 regulation loss for them, which is the fewest in the NHL. And you'd think that that would slow down at some point, but it didn't really slow down that much last year. So who knows with this team. I suppose the one thing we do know about them is that they're not going to give up a lot of goals, and as long as they can score 3 most nights, they're probably going to win, as they're giving up a still league best 2 goals per game. And as far as that's concerned, they only gave up 2 goals in regulation in each of the 3 games they played this week. They gave up the 1 extra in overtime to Montreal, but just 2 in the other ones. Plus, for the Bruins, unlike the other 3 teams that make up this top 4, it's a lot harder to nitpick them and find things that might point to potential regressions coming for these teams, like I pointed out with the Canucks and offensively with the Rangers, and we'll get to Vegas here in a second. But for Boston, even if they have been overperforming a little bit, and again, their goaltending has been saving them on occasion, they are still above league average when it comes to both goals against and goals for at 5-on-5, which, even if the results have still been good for all these teams, is not something you can say about those other 3. And even outside of the advanced stats, they're, unlike some of the others, not riding some insane shooting percentage or incredibly hot power play. Their penalty kill is probably doing better than it will on average by the end of the year. But either way, there are fewer holes that you can poke in how good of a start to the season they've had than some of those other teams. And yes, that does include the team that I still have in first place in the Vegas Golden Knights, who, outside of what some of those advanced stats and other things might point to, they're still getting the results, and they still have the most wins in the NHL. Even if that is due in part to Boston having played 1 fewer game, but Vegas' 12-2-1 record does have them with the most points, at least at this point in time. Which, as you should probably be able to tell by now, is not the only aspect in deciding where these teams fall in these power rankings, but again, results are the most important thing, so it is an important aspect of it. But largely the reason, and I did actually originally have Boston at number 1, but I ended up flipping them, mostly just because I felt both teams ended up with a loss, and while Boston's was in overtime, the loss to LA is a more understandable loss for Vegas than Boston's loss, even if it was in overtime to Montreal. And I know Montreal isn't the pushover they were last year, but it's still a team Boston probably should have been able to beat in regulation. Still, that having been said, these teams are close enough for me at this point that had Vegas had any issues beating San Jose, I probably would have bumped them down to 2, but they did handle the Sharks 5-0, and while they didn't score 10 goals against them like a couple of teams have recently, they did at least manage to shut them out. And I mean, at the point where you have 5 goals and haven't given up anything, you don't really need to score that many more. I think the point is kind of proven. Now, at the same time, for Vegas, like with Vancouver, there are some signs that some potential sliding could come here in the standings for them, and a little bit of stumbles here and there. As like Vancouver, they are actually below NHL average in both the expected goals for at 5-on-5 and expected goals against at 5-on-5, which is, again, surprising for a team that's only lost 2 games in regulation, 15 games into their season. Now, between them and Vancouver, they are a little bit closer to the average in both of those categories. So they are actually pretty close to being exactly the league average. In fact, the only team that's more mid than them would be actually the Toronto Maple Leafs. But either way, the results keep coming for Vegas one way or another. And like Vancouver, that does have something to do with the goaltending, where Adin Hill just continues to play the way that he did in that run to win the Stanley Cup in the playoffs. Meanwhile, Logan Thompson is also a top 10 goaltender at this point. But they are also right there with New York and actually Detroit and LA as well at that 12% shooting percentage, which you would think would come down at least a little bit by the end of the season. Still nowhere near that 15.3 of Vancouver, so not as big of room to think that that's going to come down and affect them in a terribly big way. Really, though, when it comes to these things that I've been pointing out here about these last few teams, it's really just all nitpicking. Again, in the end, all that really matters is the wins and losses, the results that they get, no matter how they're getting them. And for these teams, they're definitely getting these results, and regardless of what some of those advanced stats say, as long as they get the results, they're going to stay in the top of these power rankings. And for Vegas, for now, that means staying at number 1. But anyway, as always, I'd love to know what you think down in the comments section. Do you think I'm crazy for having DC on this list? Am I overreading into things a little bit too much with some of that nitpicking and advanced stats with the top teams? Or do you like that kind of thing? Who your top 10s would be? Love to hear all about it down in the comment section below. And until next time, with another week of, I mean, who knows what teams will be in that bottom 5. The top 5 teams, I think, will all be at least somewhere in the top 10, regardless of what they do, unless it's really embarrassing. But until then, if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below that help support the channel and keep you coming back if you're interested. And until then, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and go Kraken, who I would like to be on this list eventually, but I just don't know if it's going to happen.